Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Hi everyone, thanks for being here. Thank you for your practice and your resolve, your conviction, and for your study, for being part of our Sangha, yes? We're going to dive right into it today because I've been doing a lot. We're just starting out the Lankavatara, so yes, I'm doing a lot of exposition, and I feel though some of you might be frustrated with the pace at which I'm reading through the Lankavatara, but there's a lot of groundwork to set here because we are Lotus Sutra practitioners, and the Lankavatara is lacking in a lot of insight simply because of its limitation of its understanding of the consciousnesses and its history in the earlier Mahayana teachings. It isn't fully evolved, and so I'm just going to make a quick point about that. If the Lankavatara happens to be the first sutra you come into contact with, or one of the early ones, one that you sit down and actually read word for word, and whether it's Suzuki's interpretation or some other translation, and I'm kind of motivated to look for another translation, something outside of the Chan and Zen influence, if that's possible. But one could be forgiven for falling into the, it's cliche, but it's also ironic. The Lankavatara is very honed in on the facility, the power, the influence, the efficacy, the definition of life itself as a mental cognition. But Sylvain, you tell us that all the time. That Buddhism is about the mind. Yes, it is. But as a Lotus Sutra practitioner, we know that Buddhism is about the mind and how it works as a samsaric device. That the mind isn't the answer, that the mind is the facility with which we can perceive, observe the functions of the universe, of life, of samsara. But the mind isn't the source of that reality. The mind is the window, the perceiver, the gohonzon of Buddhahood. But Buddhahood is not the mind. The mind is the camera, not the subject. The subject, Buddhahood, is something we experience through the facility of our mind, via the ninth consciousness. And until you have that ninth consciousness wrapped in your understanding, then there can be and it's subtle, but it's very important, there can be this shift in thinking that Buddha itself, what Buddha, the foundation and the words. The quiescent energy, the formation of that is life. The perception of that can seem to be wholly contained within the activity of the mind. And that is that ego. That is that fallacy that, without really knowing it, or maybe it was intended, we all grew up with statements on shows, television, science programs, what have you. You remember the statements, mind over matter? And people make jokes, if you don't mind, it don't matter. No, I'm talking about actual, conversations and whole groups of philosophers and so forth, and even pseudo religions promoting the power of the mind and visualizations. And I mean, the 70s, 80s, even the 90s had so much of that kind of, if you believe it, you can make it so, right? All of that comes from the idea, and it's a substitution, really, that the human mind can make things come to fruition. And you see the language falls apart already. I don't disagree with any of those things I just said, but there's a deeper, more profound aspect going on here that's easily missed in the Lankavatara. And the dividing line is this, and I'm going to try to be brief, and then we'll just get into it. Yes, with our mind. Remember, the mind is a facility. It's an emergent property. It's not a thing. It's not an organic. It's not an organ. It's not a place or thing. It's an emergent property. So it's a facility, right? It's like you go pump iron and lift weights, and then suddenly lifting chairs and stuff in the house becomes so much like nothingness. It's just so easy to do. You've built your muscles, you've built your skeletal, you've built your body in such a way that it can perform this task far more easily. So there's a cognitive body, right, that experiences with our 8 consciousnesses how things look, how things sound, how things smell, how things taste, so on. And with those cognitive senses, those consciousnesses, we can perform tasks. We can perform tasks from making toast to falling in love, relationships. We can do a lot of what is human and samsaric via the consciousnesses of those samsaric body, brain systems of thought. But then there's this more profound, larger, there's a border crossed between what the 8 senses can provide as far as a navigation of samsaric reality and the engine from which all of those consciousnesses arise. What creates eye consciousness, oral consciousness, smell consciousness, taste consciousness, bodily feeling? Yeah. What constitutes, what energies push tendencies and conditions to develop these consciousnesses? This is something that very early on in Buddhism, the Nidana tries to address. And it's easily missed because we're very physically prone, right? So those first few steps of the Nidana, and I'll put that chart up, that initial perturbation of energy, that initial emergence, right? It doesn't know sight, sound, touch, taste. It doesn't know feelings. It doesn't have that as a projection. It's simply the impetus, that initial, which may just fall back down like a little wave. Or it may crash into another wave, and suddenly constructions start to happen. So we go from quiescence to formation. And the moment formation starts, it precipitates this explosion of attendant formations with their own tendencies and conditions. And some of those tendencies and conditions begin to favor other tendencies and conditions. Not favor like you and I favor, but because of those tendencies and conditions, they produce other potential results. But results aren't foreseen or hunted for. They're simply part of the action of the formations. Until such times as there's a sort of groupings happen, right? These tendencies and formations tend to gravitate, or tend to gravitate is a good word, because there's a form of attraction and repulsion going on there that steel likes to do what steel does, and this is pre-steel, but try to conceive in your mind of these energies amalgamating into almost preferential arrangements, but not preferentials like you and I think about. I prefer that to that. They're just part of the nature of these forms, and what their amalgams are results of certain attractive combinations and repulsions of others, and there's individuation that begins. Again, at a very, very rudimentary level, right? And all of that, whether it happens in a single moment, like we think of a singularity, or whether, as we're finding out more and more, that singularity is just a handy word we wrap around something that actually evolved over time, space. You have to have some differentiation between when something happens in order for it to evolve into something else happening. And so there you have the beginnings of time, space. And because it's the beginnings of time, space, it must take some time. Now, at some point, forms exist. And forms exist either independently or they combine and destroy with other forms. This is more akin to what we experience samsarically, right? This, not that. Other, self, right? There's that differentiation happening. And at some extreme point of amalgams, the other is clearly delineated, and we start to have plasma to, the history of the universe, right? Suns, stars, planets, so on and so forth, all the way millions of years later, intense, unknowable amounts of energies interacting and dividing and combining to result in a you and me. And this emergent property of mind, which is witnessing this. And so, because of ego, it's easy for that mind to go, look what I've done. And if I focus enough with my mind, I can alter what I create as real in the next moment, because look what I've done. And see, this is the ego. This is the problem of early teachings of Buddhism, and it finds its way into the early Mahayana, like we're seeing in the Lankavatara, where this ego is set up to be the creator and controller of everything. This is difficult with words because, in point of fact, we talk about changing our karma all the time, don't we? Changing the way our life proceeds. But I put it to you this way. It's one thing to say that your mind is all powerful and can control the actual physical universe. And it's quite another thing to say that your mind is immensely powerful as a vehicle of influence to a process that's happening well outside of you. This is a super critical point here that is often missed by this almost romantic adhesion to the mind as creator, as creator from nothingness to manipulate the stuff of the universe as its own creation. This is the mind-only doctrine, and it's very, very easy to fall in love with, because it's as profound as it is, it's still materialistic. It still satisfies the me, the ego. And so, strictly speaking, it's not Mahayana. It's early Mahayana. It's progressive from earlier thoughts because it recognizes formation, but it makes the mind, the Lanka, the alaya consciousness, the fundament, and therefore the mind, as the progenitor of life. And that's wrong. That's one step not far enough. You ever go down the stairs and miss that last stair and you hit the ground? Right? You got to hit that last step. Imagine if you did that going up, you'd trip and hurt yourself. You got to get to the landing. And the Lanka doesn't quite get there. So I want you to be mindful of that, because we're going to learn a lot about the mind, and that's Buddhism, and that's good, and there's nothing wrong with that, apart from the assumption that it is the ultimate, because it isn't. It's a step along the way. All right? So you're going to hear a lot here, this translation, mind only, if you understand mind only. But I want you, as a Lotus Sutra practitioners, to understand, that's where the limit is in this sutra. We know better. We know all of that, plus we know that very thing that is elucidated in the Lankavatara is itself a product of formation. And that when we chant and enlighten and awaken our Buddha, We're not awakening a samsaric thing. We're awakening a pre-samsaric, an outside, a surrounding perception by virtue of mind of the true nature of all things. We are a lens, right? And Buddhahood is a release not only of all things perceived by the mind, but of the mind itself. And that is a step much further than what we're hearing, certainly from Suzuki here in the Lankavatara. It's a very important distinction, and it's one of those distinctions because it's easy to fall in love with the mind that kind of makes you go, well, what? But it's really important to study this because it clarifies what we do and how we experience Buddhahood when we chant to our mirror, our perfect mirror, the mandala, to enable us to see beyond the mind, experience beyond the mind, the human samsaric mind of discrimination. The more you think about it, the more this will make sense. Because Buddhahood isn't a discrimination. It's simply an experience beyond discriminations. That's why it's such an emancipation. And even using these terminologies, the Lanka tries to put all of this into the karmic freight train. But Buddhahood isn't part of the karmic freight train. It's outside the karmic freight train. That makes sense, Sylvain. But as I said before, the Lanka is still shoehorning that into the Alaya, and that's an error. And it's an error that stands out to us because we're Lotus Sutra Buddhists. But at the time, it must have seemed incredibly insightful. Yeah? There's many schools based on it to this day. All right, so let's get into it. How much time did I spend? Part 8. Perceiving that the triple existence is by reason of the habit energy of erroneous discriminations and false reasoning that has been going on since beginningless time. See, this is all alaya consciousness. This is about that karmic freight train, right? It never says this has been going on since before beginningless time. That would be a conundrum, but that would be more accurate. And also thinking of the state of Buddhahood, which is imageless and unborn, which hints at exactly what I was just describing. However, because it is the Lankavatara, doesn't seem to get out of its own way. Let's continue. Let's just read. The Bodhisattva will become thoroughly conversant with the noble truth of self-realization. See how this is all samsaric. Will become a perfect master of his own mind. Will conduct himself without effort. Will be like a gem reflecting a variety of colors. Will be able to assume the body of transformation. Will be able to enter into the subtle minds of all beings. And because of his firm belief in the truth of mind only, will be gradually ascending the stages, becoming established in Buddhahood. Therefore, Mahamati, let the Bodhisattva Mahasattva be well disciplined in self-realization. Now, from our perspective, Lotus Sutra practicants, we can read that and understand that the self-realization being discussed here is a realization of that ninth outside the mind, but experienced by the mind, consciousness. It's a consciousness because it belongs to samsara. but it's a window to something that's a priori, that the mind is produced from, not mind only, but that the mind is a great lens with which to witness and pay homage to the formations of all phenomena as being equal, equanimous, including mind and self. So words like self-realization, see how the language gets in the way? But really what it means is utilizing our apparatus, including our emergent mind, in order to truly see beyond the facility of mind to its source, to its impetus, and see that that impetus is no different and not unique or separate in any of the manifestations we experience in samsara. It's just a nudge, but it's a big nudge. Yeah? Then Mahamati said, "Teach me, O emancipated one, concerning that most subtle doctrine which explains the Sita, Manas, Manovijnana, the five dharmas, the svabhavas, and the lakshanas, which is put in practice by the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, which is separated from the state of mind, which recognizes a world as something outside mind itself." Now he's talking about the distinction of self and other, yeah? "And which, breaking down all the so-called truths established by words and reasonings, constitutes the essence of the teaching of all the Buddhas. Teach this assembly, headed by the Bodhisattva gathering on Mount Malaya in the city of Lanka. Teach them regarding the Dharmakaya, which is praised by the Tathagatas, and which is the realm of the Alaya Vijnana, which resembles the ocean with its waves." It's accurate. He's not asking where the ocean came from. He's saying that the Alaya Vijnana is the ocean with its distinctions, its waves, the Vijnana. So it's not inaccurate, but that's from our point of view, because we understand what's being said here. But the students of the day, and those who still adhere to it to this day, aren't quite getting that distinction, or the lack of, more accurately. Then the emancipated one, again speaking to Mahamati, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, said this: "The reasons whereby the I consciousness arises are four. What are they? They are: 1, the clinging to an external world, not knowing that it is of mind itself. 2, the attaching to form and habit energy accumulated since beginningless time by false reasoning and erroneous views. This all precipitates from the formations, right? And that act of formation and form begets an adherence. An adherence that says, I am an atom. I am a molecule. I am a this or a that. The discriminations start immediately when that begins, that process begins. Long before a mind even is conceived of in order to perceive it. And this is in the Nidana. This is this idea that once things start to amalgamate, there forms a bond that's curious about the nature of bond, right? And if you read through the Nidana, or, the best book I've read on this was by Julius Evola, the Doctrine of Awakening. It's an old publication, and if you can just focus in on the conditioned genesis part, the nirvana, his dissection of the nidana is so beautiful. I encourage you to find that, and if I remember to put a link to that in the description, I will do that, because it's a really great read. And third, the self-nature inherent in the Vijnana. Remember, the Vijnana are facilities of the emergent properties of mind. And so the self-nature inherent in the Vijnana, because the Vijnanas are also self-possessed creations of themselves, for the eagerness for multiple forms and appearances, right? Because as the formations in the nidana turn into form, then the form has at some point a mechanism of acknowledging that it exists. I can't think of better words right now, and Evola was better at this than I am. Which at some point requires that if you want to know, if form wants to know form, it needs a mechanism by which to perceive form. And by working toward producing a mechanism to perceive form, then there must also be qualities of those forms in order for them to be recognized. And this is when Buddhism talks about the object of cognition, right? The object of the consciousnesses. Because you can't have an I consciousness without having something for the I to be conscious of. And then the interplay of what those two things need to perform or be is defined by a particular parameters of seeing. Why is seeing about certain bands of light? Because light has no mass and it's just energy. There are a lot of clues here. And that light must be reflected or come from some object to be seen in order for seeing to see. This is in the Nidana, and it describes the initial steps of formations and form toward consciousnesses. It's very fascinating. So, these four, what did he call them? Oh, yeah, he's picking on the I consciousness alone here, and he's saying there are 4 reasons why it arises. He doesn't go as in depth as the Nidana, but he's referencing the Nidana when he says there's a clinging to the external world, not knowing it is of mind itself, because the mind doesn't exist yet, but there's a clinging, an attraction of tendencies and conditions amalgamating because of their attraction. The attachment of form and habit energy accumulated since that very moment when it started, right? The habit energy being this tendency continues and multiplies itself. The self-nature inherent in the Vijnana, so now there's a big leap beyond this formation to a mind that perceives it, thinks to itself it's invented it, instead of the other way around. You see where the tripwire is here? And the eagerness for multiple forms and appearances, Because now that I can perceive, I want more. I want to perceive everything. This is the samsaric disease. From this comes all desire, craving. But how can it be desire and craving if there's no form? And see, this is the fallacy of the alaya consciousness as the end-all, be-all foundation. Because the karma that's created is created. But the energy that provided the opportunity for that potential to manifest, that's Buddhahood. That's outside of the karmic creations, the karma formations, right? And that's something not discussed yet in this teaching. Let's move on. By these four reasons, Mahamati, the waves of the evolving Vijnanas are stirred on the alaya Vijnana, which resembles the waters of a flood. So he's talking about the rapidity with which this accumulates, right? The same can be said of the other sense consciousnesses, right? Touch, aura, sense, smell, so on. As of the eye consciousness. These consciousnesses arise at once or by degrees in every sense organ, including its atoms and pores of the skin. The sense field is apprehended like a mirror reflecting objects, like the ocean swept over by a wind. Mahamati, similarly, the waves of the mind ocean are stirred uninterruptedly by the wind of objectivity. And what is objectivity but a grasping of objects? Cause, deed, and appearance condition one another inseparably. The functioning Vijnanas and the original Vijnana are thus inextricably bound up together. And because the self-nature of form, etc., is not comprehended, Mahamati, the system of the five consciousnesses, Vijnanas, comes to function. Along with this system of the five Vijnanas, there is what is known as the Mano Vijnana, i.e., the thinking function of consciousness, whereby the objective world is distinguished and individual appearances are distinctly determined, and in this the physical body has its genesis. But the Mano Vijnana and other Vijnanas have no thought that they are mutually conditioned and that they grow out of their attachment to the discrimination which is applied to the projections of the mind itself. So they've hermetically sealed in this I've got this itch in that palm of my hand. So this is a bit of a short circuit, isn't it? The assumption is made, as I've pointed out several times now, that the mind exists at the initial point of nidana. And this is the little sidestep of the ninth consciousness that enlightenment remains within the sphere of the physical samsaric world. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm saying it isn't constructed of it. It's pre-construction. Otherwise, everything Shakyamuni's ever said about the Dharma having no existence, the Buddha having no existence, which is always confounding and confusing and somewhat seems, because of that, mystical and magical, doesn't make sense until we get to the Lotus Sutra. Thus, the Vijnanas go on functioning mutually related in a most intimate manner and discriminating a world of representations, or as I say, expressions of potential. As the Vijnanas thus go on functioning without being conscious of their own doings, So the yogins, while entering upon a state of tranquilization, samapati, are not aware of the workings of the subtle habit energy or memory. I've already dissected that. Within themselves, for they think that they would enter upon a state of tranquilization by extinguishing the vijnanas, but in fact, they are in this state without extinguishing the vijnanas, which still subsist because the seeds of habit energy have not been extinguished. And what they imagine to be an extinction is really the non-functioning of the external world to which they are no more attached. So it is, Mahamari, with the subtle workings of the Alaya Vijnana, which, except for the Tathagata and those bodhisattvas who are established on the stages, is not easy to comprehend, especially by those who practice the discipline belonging to the Shravakas, Pratyagabuddhas, and philosophers. Even with their powers of samadhi and transcendental knowledge, it is difficult to distinguish, I'd say. Only those who, understanding fully all the aspects of the different stages of bodhisattvahood, by the aid of their transcendental knowledge, acquiring a definite cognition as regards the meaning of the separate propositions, planting roots of goodness in the Buddha lands that know no limits, and keeping themselves away from the discriminations and false reasonings that arise from recognizing an external world which is of mind itself, would retire into a secluded abode in the forest and devote themselves to practice of the spiritual discipline, either high or low or middling. Only those are capable of obtaining an insight into the flowing of mind itself in a world of discrimination, of being baptized by the Buddhas, living in the lands without limits, and of realizing the self-control, powers, psychic faculties, and samadhis. Surrounded by good friends and the Buddhas, Mahamati, they are capable of knowing the Sita Manas Mano Vijnana, which are the discriminating agents of an external world, whose self-nature is of mind itself. They are capable of crossing the ocean of birth and death, which arises by reason of deed, desire, and ignorance. For this reason, Mahamati, the yogins ought to exercise themselves in the discipline which has been given them by their good friends and the Buddhas. At that time, the emancipated one, Shakyamuni, recited the following verses. Now, I've often said that the verses are the actual sermon, and everything else is exposition depending on the audience. So I'm going to pause here before we get into that. And I want to point out again, because it's easy to get lost in the poetics here, everything that's being said in this sutra is accurate. I'm not trying to diminish the accuracy of the sutra. I'm just trying to place it in the canon of Buddhism where it hasn't quite arrived at the full flourishing that you and I know as the Lotus Sutra. It hasn't gotten to this ultimate understanding that everything said in the Lankavatara is about using the mind to transcend the understanding of the constructed self. Absolutely accurate. But that what we do beyond this insight, which we have anyway, we get it by virtue of our practice. This is just a really intimate transmission of this breaking away, albeit within itself, which only validates that Buddhahood can only be experienced with this mind, but it shouldn't be a construction of the mind. And this is where the struggle happens. So in the Lankavatara, it seems so easily palpable because this is all done with our minds that we own, that we have, that we individuate, that we identify. So with this mind, we can transcend what this mind has been doing since beginningless time, this energy of formation and the forms. We can disconnect, but not completely, because the mind we use to disconnect is also a construction. This is the maddening part. Only when we get to the Tathagata chapter and the Shakyamuni says, okay, stop with this ideation of self. Buddha is not anywhere in that. Buddha is a priori. It's a condition where tendencies and conditions can be constructed. It's a place without tendency. It's an energy without expression. But you can see it, you can perceive it, and it is outside of self, outside of this engine. But it is where this engine gets its start. And it is true of every phenomena. And you can experience it. Because your mind is of that same condition that all things are from, evolved. This Dharma experience of all karma, right? Energy with work, has its beginning in beginninglessness. And that perception is what we call Buddha-ness. It's not a thing in and of itself. It's a thing experienced in a mind that's fully detached from all phenomena. So it's identified in samsara, but has no identity. Make sense? All right, that's it for today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your practice. Please keep doing so. Take care of your health. Be kind to yourself. Give yourself a break. You're human after all. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, patrons, for your unending support. It's so vital to keep this channel going. Please, if you got anything out of this video, please consider subscribing. It really helps do our bodhisattva work and get this channel out to more people. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.